Hi everyone, Ryan here from IKN, and it's a pleasure to be asked to participate in the International Physiotherapy Congress on behalf of Master Science Lab to share our insight into our approach at IKN and how we apply neuroscience with musculoskeletal or orthopedic rehabilitation. And so today we're going to take you through a sequence or the framework of our treatment and what we teach in our courses, and why it's important to look at applied neuroscience and how it fits in with musculoskeletal and orthopedic care, because we feel, and we're always asked the question, why do you incorporate more of a multisensory approach when it comes to rehab of pain and movement-based issues? And really the basic idea is that as we move, we rely on feedback from more than just our muscles, joints, tendons, and ligaments. Okay, because when we think of our nervous system, when we think of our brain is in a little black cave, and the only way it has access to the outside world is through our senses, through the feedback from our mechanoreceptors, from our receptors in our skin, in our joints, in our muscles and tendons, from the feedback from our eyes especially as well, and from our inner ear, our vestibular system, and how all that information is integrated together to allow us to produce coordinated motor output. Okay, and it's important to understand that difference between true force production and coordinative output as well. So if we can improve the coordination of our motor output, then that's what allows us to move in the most energy efficient way. And to move in a coordinated manner requires as many systems and as many layers as possible to accept load and tolerate load well. Our peripheral tissues through muscles, joints, tendons, ligaments, our peripheral nerves, our sensory systems, the visual system, the vestibular system, all these systems need to be able to accept and tolerate load well, so we can improve the overall force sharing capacity. If we can improve the overall force sharing capacity of the body, then we can allow for movement that's more efficient in the amount of energy exchanged, where we're not just moving through and depending on one system over the other. So incorporating a multisensory rehabilitation approach or a multisensory graded exposure rehab approach, where we're really trying to work with the body in terms of understanding what can't accept load well and allowing it to safely experience load through those lines of communication to push self-organization in the right direction. Because a lot of our clinical care is done in a clinical environment, in a gym environment, where it's certain and it's controlled, but the real world is full of uncertainty, full of unpredictability. So we want the clients, the individuals that we treat from a pain perspective, or from just improving their overall moving capacity, we want them to be able to adapt, to be adaptable and robust in the real world, so they can tolerate a lot of stress, because they're going to have to engage with stress, a lot of stress in the real world. We want them to be able to adapt to that. So the need for protection in the form of pain, in the form of excessive stiffness and tension, is not really warranted, or doesn't really hold any kind of value. And that's really the kind of the overall idea behind applied neuroscience and musculoskeletal care, is understanding that there are many lines of communication from a bottom up and a top down perspective that influence our motor output. And so the overall goal of IKN is, like I said, is to identify and treat poor multisensory loading patterns and understand that there are many layers that we accept load through. And again, we're going to explain it in very, very basic language now, but obviously it's much deeper than this. We go into this in much more detail and offer much more clarity on our courses. But really, movement is an expression of the quality of the information that we gather from our external and our internal environments. So we gather information internally from our proprioceptive system, so from the feedback from our muscles, joints, tendons, ligaments. Can each one of those layers, and even the peripheral nerves as well, can each of those layers accept and tolerate load well? And we look at this in terms of directional changes in motor output as well. And so we break this down into a certain assessment strategy through the proprioceptive system. But even when you think of the proprioceptive system as a whole as well, when you think of the midline of the body versus the limbs, the upper limbs and the lower limbs, the neurological control of the midline is different to the neurological control of the limbs. So we require a lot more reflexive control of the midline, and that means that we want the lines of communication from the reflexive centers or the sensory systems that have reflexive lines of communication into the muscles surrounding our midline to be operating well and to be able to accept load well. And the main centers there are is the vestibular system and the visual system. So the vestibular and the visual system communicate with our body in the form of tone, in the form of changing tone, increasing tone or decreasing tone throughout the midline of our body. But they also have an influence over our peripheral tissues as well. And so we want movement that is a lot more effortless and not cautious. Okay, and in order to allow it to happen, we need to allow certain parts of our body to generate purposeful movement and other parts of our body to allow for subconscious control. And so we don't want to have to consciously or purposefully contract or brace our core, you can say, our midline, as we move, because that doesn't allow for the midline of the body to operate in the way it ideally should. We want our intention to develop through our eyes, to fixate on targets, to coordinate our movement towards a target of interest. We want our hands to be able to move towards targets and interact with the world, and we want our feet to be able to have some kind of intentional purpose as well. Because when you think of how we transmit force through our peripheral tissues, our limbs, we transmit force through our hands and through our feet. So we don't really see anyone doing things with their elbows or picking up things with their shoulders or running down the street on their knees or their hips, but they have to transmit mechanical force through jet-ground reaction forces and dissipate that force through the peripheral tissues well in a manner that improves the force sharing capacity around the lower limb and the upper limb as we integrate or interact with the worlds. So we want to improve the force transmission from the hands upstream and from the foot upstream as well, and we assess this in a specific manner on our courses, looking at it from a directional approach, understanding what tissues are able to accept load well, what tissues aren't able to accept load well. And when we think of the visual and vestibular system, we're trying to drive the ability for those systems to accept load well to have an effect on our midline and how that can regulate movement as well. But it's not just those systems, it's the feedback from the midline as well, through the breath, through the pressure of air into different parts of the ribcage, through the ability to get certain muscles like your diaphragm through full range of motion as well, for us to be able to access different ranges of motion. So it's not just about improving force production through the midline, but it's more so about reflexive control. And to improve that reflexive control, we need to look at these top-down influences. And when it comes to our limbs, we still need to look at those, but we need to look at the force transmission and the ability of the tendons and muscles to be able to transmit force well, so that we can improve the force sharing capacity through those tissues as well. All right. So these three systems make up the majority of the input to our nervous system. Now we can obviously go into much more detail about this, but we just want to keep it short and sweet and just give you some kind of insight into their importance. So we're looking for that poor load distribution, that asymmetrical loading perhaps, because that's going to be reflected in our movement patterns. So we're essentially just stepping back and assessing, not trying to predict how it should look, but just looking at what the client is missing, what the client's avoiding, what they're not able to accept load well through, so that we can allow them to safely experience that load and push recovery and rehab in the right direction, because it's going to be unique to the individual. And so here we have a pyramid that offers a framework of importance, you can say, and how we might work through a care plan with a client. Because up here you can see at the fourth layer, here we have sensory integration, and this is when we start to incorporate the eyes, the inner ear, and more top-down control. Because we're not going to, when a client comes to see us with some kind of pain experience, we're not going to just jump into the eyes, we're not going to just jump into the inner ear, because the client has expectations for how their treatment is going to look as well. And that's a really, really important factor to understand. It's really important to understand their unique past experiences, their unique injury history, their exercise history, their beliefs. So it really sheds light on the importance of pain neuroscience education as well, and understanding their beliefs and their goals and their past experiences. And that kind of just sheds light on the importance of their overall neurological, psychological or physiological status, let's say. Like, what kind of status is the client in? Are they in a physiological state to be able to accept load, Or do we need to change the sequence of treatment before we just start dumping exercises on the clients? Because sometimes they're driving in a sympathetic behavior, let's say, and we don't want to just dump lots of stimulus on top of that. We want to allow them to kind of drift from that sympathetically driven orientation towards more of a rest and digest, or more of a relaxed state, you can say. Just essentially giving them more resources to be able to accept load well. Because if I'm in a sympathetic state, I'm not going to be in a position to be able to adapt in a positive manner to lots of other sources of load through exercises, through manual therapy, and so on. So I need to do things to try and get me out of that state first, so I'm in a position to better adapt to the treatment plan. And that can involve, we'll get to it on the other slide, but it can involve looking at their global movement ability. It can involve looking at their balance, understanding their past experiences, understanding you can look at different positions of the rib cage as well to understand what kind of status they're in as well. And then we can move up the pyramid to understand how we can build that load tolerance through each layer. Are they able to coordinate the breath? If they can they coordinate it with loading the proprioceptive system? How tolerant to load are they in each of these layers, and especially in this one, because this is going to affect everything. So instead of just changing the exercise or breathing without any kind of movement, we want to understand, can we change the physiology of the individual before we just start jumping in and out of different exercises? Because from an IKM perspective, that's more important than the actual exercise itself, is what kind of physiology is the client in to be able to adapt to that and self-organize with that stimulus, with that load or that exercise. So really the overall approach involves delivering the necessary information that the brain needs to coordinate movements. Okay, and that comes back to the assessment. So every client's unique, so the assessment is crucial, and not just dumping load on them. Right. So, and obviously understanding that we require more than just the proprioceptive system, like we mentioned before. We require more lines of communication to be able to tolerate load well, to allow for movement to occur on more reflexive levels, so we can direct our purposeful or intentional control towards other things. Because you're not walking down the street thinking about your glute, or you're not walking down the street thinking about the control around your ankle, or when you move your shoulder, you shouldn't have to think about all the micro movements that allow you to coordinate that, but you should set an intention or a goal to achieve something, and then allow for that reflexive or subconscious control beneath your conscious awareness. So all these things should smoothly coordinate. All the muscles, joints, tendons, ligaments should coordinate movement smoothly as you direct your intention towards a target of interest, towards moving in a certain direction, or just coordinating your movement as you walk down the street, or as you move in a sporting situation. So it's important to understand how each of these layers are accepting load as you move through a graded exposure approach. And so just to get into the neurological or psychological status for a second, and that just involves understanding what is the current state of the client right now. Are they in a state of stress? Are they in a state where they can effectively respond to treatment? And so we need to do things to identify that. And again, even before that, it comes back to establishing that connection, building that sense of trust and that sense of safety with the client. Are you the therapist for them? Are you just jumping into looking at their muscles and their joints? Or are you actually having a conversation with them? Really important. But using different biofeedback marker tests to understand their homeostatic thresholds. And that just means, again, is there thresholds here where if they tip over this, then they experience pain, they experience more stress response? Are they right below here? They're not in a position then to just tolerate much more load. It's going to tip them over the edge. So we need to understand what they're missing, and then allow them to safely experience load, so we can bring them back down towards baseline so that they can take more stress before they tip over the edge. But we need to understand at what position they're at before we start to kind of layer on stimulus or load through a manual therapy or through exercise therapy. And that's one of the most important things that we feel is missing from therapy, from treatment nowadays, is that we're all focused on the next fancy technique, the next technique that looks really cool and sexy to deliver manual therapy or exercise to someone, but we don't understand what kind of physiology the client's in to be able to adapt to that. Because at the end of the day, all stimulus, be it manual therapy, be it exercise, is just raw sensory stimulus. The receptors in the peripheral tissues are just transducing that pressure from someone's hands into a nerve impulse that your brain has to get up. Your spinal cord will get it, it'll travel up to the nervous system, and your brain has to respond to that. So at the end of the day, it's just a nerve impulse traveling to your central nervous system. Your central nervous system of your client doesn't know how much you spent on that course to learn these techniques, so it doesn't really care. It cares about where it needs the load. The area, direction, how much load is necessary is more important to how really you actually deliver that load. And that really makes the treatment process much more unique to the client and much more simple from our perspective. And so you want to use certain global tests and biofeedback marker tests to allow for a teaching platform as well, to talk about the eyes, to talk about the vestibular system and how feedback from different parts of the body have an effect on your overall movement control. And you can do that in a minute, 2 minutes with a client, and that serves as a way to get buy-in from your clients, to understand how the eyes affect the body, how the inner ear affects the body, how areas of poor load acceptance through different parts of the body affect your overall movements, and we teach those a lot in our courses as well. But really, for the purposes of this webinar, we just want you to understand that the physiology of the client is extremely important, not just the mode of exercise or the mode of manual therapy that you use. And obviously at this point as well, we're looking at, can we give the client a clear expectation or a clear idea of what the assessment and what the treatment's going to look like, because that will serve to reduce any kind of fear that they might have as well. Because the client in pain is coming to see you and they might not know what to expect. They have a certain expectation of that they might do a little bit of exercise, you might do a little bit of manual therapy, but if we can give them a better idea of what to expect, then we can have an effect on their overall physiology as well. And so simple little things like that, without going into too much detail, should give you hopefully more of an ability to step back and just understand what kind of state the client's in before we start to go straight in with our movement and manual therapy. And then we get to the importance of coordinating the breath. And there's an awful lot of research on how your respiratory system should be able to accept load as well. So your respiratory system can have a massive effect on the amount of tone that you hold in your muscles as well, and how well oxygen is delivered into the muscles too. A lot of the research talks about how individuals hyperventilate. We breathe far too quickly. When we breathe far too quickly, it reduces the amount of carbon dioxide that we have in our system. And that reduced carbon dioxide in our system doesn't allow oxygen to actually get into our peripheral tissues to support sensory stimulation through manual therapy or through exercise. Okay? And that also has an influence on the sensitivity that we hold in our nerves as well, just to keep it simple. So when we have less carbon dioxide, our pH goes up. That's going to have an effect on the amount of calcium in our body, and that's going to affect the voltage gated channels, sodium channels, which is going to actually bring nerves closer to the threshold. So it takes much less stimulus to actually create a reaction in a nerve. And that's why you can see muscles just on edge, where you do something or you might palpate someone and they're very, very sensitive to touch, or they're very sensitive to any kind of manual therapy, or they're very sensitive to any kind of exercise. The respiratory system is the most important thing to influence in that case, and then start to coordinate that with your movement, with your manual therapy, but understanding it in a way that allows us to work with the chemical nature of the body as well, improving that biochemistry through changing the cadence of our breath, focusing on more the exhalation to build that carbon dioxide tolerance in the body as well, and then not just focusing on that, but then bringing that into our manual therapy, bringing that especially into our progressive loading approaches too. And we have up here as well, we don't want to get too deep into the neuroscience But breathing is going to have a massive effect on a part of our brain called the cerebellum too. The cerebellum is that little part of the brain that allows us to coordinate movement well, and it requires an awful lot of resources, you can say. If you were ever to dissect the human brain and you look at the cortex is very squishy in nature when you actually palpate it in a cadaver, whereas the cerebellum is very dense. It's almost like a muscle. And that's because the cerebellum is so small, but it contains over half the neurons for the whole central nervous system. So it has a very high metabolic capacity, and it needs lots of sensory stimulus. It needs oxygen. And so when we talk about on our courses, there's different parts of the cerebellum that control or regulate different parts of the body. But the middle part of the cerebellum regulates the midline of the body. So it takes in a lot of feedback from your rib cage, from your diaphragm, from your ability to breathe well, to get oxygen into those parts of the brain. And so, that being said, if we can improve the mechanoreceptor feedback through more ideal breathing patterns, better rib cage movement, better movement tolerance, and moving our diaphragm through a lengthened and shortened state, then we can improve the feedback through to our cerebellum to allow for better movement coordination. And we get into that in much more detail in our courses. But we just want to allow the individual to accept load well through their respiratory system before we start adding load through the proprioceptive system. And that requires an assessment as well. Very, very simple. But we can get into positions as well where we can actually use the ocular reflexes. And there's a good bit of research to show how when we move our eyes in a particular direction, that's going to alter, like we said, the tone in our body to get ready to move towards that direction. And so this is done through a pathway called your tectospinal tract, which takes visual stimuli and changes in our eye movements and produces a reaction or response in tone throughout our body. So some of you might have done this before, where you place the finger pads right beneath the tip of right beneath your occiput and your suboccipital muscles. You keep the head nice and still, and you maintain moderate pressure into those areas, and you move your eyes left and right at a moderate pace, and you see if you feel any change in tone. You might feel an increase and a decrease in tone in these muscles here as you move your eyes left and right, and that reflects the importance of that tectospinal tract that takes the eye movements and changes the tone to direct movement, to prepare us to direct movement. And so you can use the ocular reflexes to bring changes in tone in the body. Let's say if I have a lot of tone in my extensor muscles in my back, I can change the eye position, layer my breath in a particular position to try and reduce the output of muscle tone in those areas, to allow for us to then load the proprioceptive system in a much better manner, because again we're improving the physiology of the client by working with the breath, by working with the ocular reflexes and with higher order systems at the same time too. So there's lots of things that you can do with the breath and with the respiratory system that will help to push recovery and self-organization in the right direction as well. But it understands looking at what systems require good feedback and understanding where the client is missing mechanoreceptor feedback, where we need to load essentially. And that's neurology in a nutshell, is that you want to find where the client can't accept load well, and progressively allow them to accept load well to improve the overall force sharing capacity and movement potential of our movement. And then we move on to proprioceptive loading. And with this assessment procedure, we're not looking at individual muscles here. Like we said before, we don't interact with the world through our elbow. We don't interact with the world through our knees or our hips. We interact with the world through our hands and through our feet, and particularly through our eyes. And so we want to look for directional changes in load tolerance. And so we kind of split it up into looking at individual muscles, but how those individual muscles work with the entire chain. And so we're not looking for black and white changes in weakness versus strength, because doing a test, we don't do much muscle testing. We do different types of hands-on testing to understand how that individual can coordinate movements in different positions. But if you were just to do a muscle test, you're essentially using an isometric contraction to understand the force output of that particular muscle. That, from an IKN lens, that really gives us no insight into how that individual moves in the real world. So we're going to be looking at things from a coordinative standpoint versus a strength standpoint. And so we're going to be looking at, can that individual kind of match the force of the practitioner? Are they able to incorporate multiple joints through a movement test? Can they hold their ability to maintain motor output through a range of motion to give us an idea of their ability to control that limb essentially as our mass changes direction? And the basic idea here is looking at the proprioceptive system from a directional standpoint as opposed to an isolated muscle standpoint, because when you change position, the influence of the affected muscles will change. So here versus here is a different physiology for my body, and it's going to require different muscular output to give me the ability to coordinate that position. Same thing with the vestibular system. We have many canals in the inner ear that pick up changes in head movements. It's more about the direction. When I move my head in a certain direction, certain receptors will pick up that load, that stress, communicate that to my nervous system. So it's all about enabling better load tolerance through certain directions and in different positions, as opposed to looking at the black and white difference between, is that individual strong or is that individual weak? There's a lot more information we can gain from hands-on assessment and movement assessment, as opposed to just the black and white idea of weakness versus strength. Because we need muscles to be both. We need muscles to be able to relax at certain times, but we need them to be able to produce force at certain times too. And really, for us at IKN, a better reflection of robust movement is an ability of your peripheral tissues to relax, as well as improved motor output. Because if our muscles, like we said before, are always in ready mode, it takes very little to tip them over the edge where they're displaying some kind of contraction. That's a sign that, again, we're not in the best state to be able to adapt to more stress. And that may lead to protection in the form of pain and stiffness when protection is not necessary. So we're looking at the mechanoreceptor feedback through directions and how in terms of like an intramuscular coordination, how muscles work together, how they transmit force from the hands up through the whole limb, from the foot up through the whole limb in different directions and different positions. And trust me, this really makes our ability to establish an ideal treatment plan much more easy for the practitioner and for the client to perform home exercises at home, where they're not having to do 10 different exercises, but we can establish the direction that they need to improve load tolerance through, and then we can add more load, more qualitative load to those in the form of coordinating the breath in different ways, in the form of adding top-down influences through other tasks and other sensory integration procedures to really build the ability to coordinate that motor output whilst being able to do other things at the same time. And we want to respect the difference between midline versus limb neurological control as well. So essentially we just want to build tolerance through peripheral tissues according to different directions, okay? And then that will guide where we deliver our exercises. That will also guide where we deliver our manual therapy, where we might kind of load up peripheral nerves, where we load them up. Do we load them up on their back? Do we load them up in a quadruped position? Do we do it in standing? Or can we use that as a nice framework to build greater load tolerance as we change position too? We just want to understand that when we change position, that's going to change our physiology. In this position, I'm loading up different tissues. That's going to affect how they respond to input. This position is different, this position is different, this position is different. Every positional change is a change in physiology, and that's going to change how you adapt to load essentially. And we want to improve how you accept load well in as many positions as possible, okay, to allow you that movement variability that the research shows is so important. But we want to do it in a very specific way as well to guide our treatment approach. And then we come to the sensory integration portion. And just like we said before, we want to accept load well through our peripheral tissues, through our midline tissues, our peripheral tissues through our limbs, upper limb, lower limb. But we also want to identify any kind of sensory load discrepancies through the visual system, through the vestibular system, but also even through the jaw and how the cerebellum is integrating all that information together as well. And so when we're looking at the visual system, we're going to look at eye movement systems. Can the eyes maintain their ability to stabilize their gaze on targets to allow for smooth movement coordination? If my eyes can't stabilize their gaze on targets, that's going to create a lot of noise, a lot of chatter in the nervous system, and that's going to affect how I coordinate my movement on a reflexive level as well. So really, really simple assessments and integration procedures will then stem from the assessment here. But like always, we're going to layer them with change the physiology. You can change positions, integrating the breath, integrating the proprioceptive load tolerance through different directions through specific peripheral tissues, and then integrating the sensory systems. We're not just going to do eye movements, vestibular work just for the sake of it. Okay, we're going to identify exactly where that individual requires load through, and then start to engage the higher order systems to improve top-down influence as well. Okay, we spoke a little bit about the vestibular system too, how the vestibular system has reflexive lines of communication with the eyes, with the midline of the body. So if we can improve the vestibular system or the load tolerance through the specific parts of the vestibular system as well, we can improve the connection and the reflexive control of the muscles around my midline, which will provide a better platform for my limbs to move as well. So the idea of proximal control for distal movement is important, but it's proximal control not in the sense of bracing, consciously bracing your core to allow for movement of our limbs, but allowing for subconscious control through good lines, good reflexive lines of communication to the midline from higher order systems to allow for intentional movement, purposeful movement in a way that transmits force well through our limbs. That's really the important piece there. And then we can even go a little bit deeper into the cerebellum and look at the jaw as well. The jaw is extremely important to understand and look at how the trigeminal nerve especially is accepting load from a laterality standpoint, because the trigeminal nerve is an extremely important nerve because it has an awful lot of nociceptive fibers that produce different neuropeptides throughout the body that can change our sensitivity to load as well. And so the jaw is definitely one that if you can work through it in a specific manner and load it in a specific manner, we can see a lot of global changes throughout the body as well, but particularly in through the neck, through the head, and through the upper quarters of the body as well. And then building an ability to progress and build multi-sensory awareness as we move up through higher levels of this pyramid here. Okay, so really just to recap, we firstly want to identify the neurological state of the client, their physiology, how much load can that individual tolerate. Once we establish that, we can work with the breath, coordinate the breath, allow the respiratory system to tolerate load as well. Then moving on to identifying areas, patterns or directions of poor load absorption through the proprioceptive system. Okay, whilst we're trying to create a right environment throughout the rest of the body too. Okay, so we're going to start to layer our proprioceptive loading procedures or exercises via manual therapy, via exercise therapy in a specific manner, which we teach on the course an awful lot, whilst allowing for the right physiology, the right environment. So we layer proprioceptive system loading with the breath to change the physiology, and then we start to progressively or gradually load higher order sensory systems to improve our multi-sensory load tolerance, essentially, to allow every layer, every system to tolerate load well, to improve the adaptive nature of the body and how we move through the real world, to allow for movement to be effortless, to allow for movement to be robust, so we can take a lot of stress. It takes a lot of stress to perturb our system. Really, the idea of being robust, it takes a lot to perturb you. It takes a lot to produce a protective response, an excessively protective response in the form of pain, excessive stiffness and tension. So it always comes back to the assessment, identify where that individual can't load well. It can be through multiple systems. We want to paint a picture of how we can assess that and how we can incorporate that into a treatment program, and then incorporate that within a graded exposure rehab approach. Make it simple so the client can become empowered to do that at home, and then we can continuously check back in and use those feedback markers to understand, are they positively adapting, and are we facilitating neuroplastic change that allows for positive adaptation. And that's really it. Obviously, we can spend hours and hours and hours talking about the influence of applied neuroscience on musculoskeletal rehabilitation. Hopefully this gives you some kind of insight into how important it is to at least consider top-down influence on the peripheral structures. But when you really start to look at the body in this way and look at pain in this way and movement in this way, we can really create more simple rehab programs and treatment procedures for clients, and take a lot of stress off the practitioner as well. So once again, thank you for your time, and we hope to see you soon.